Hello and welcome to Africa Here and Now, the conversation you've always wanted to have about the continent. I'm Martine Dennis. Today, we ask Zeinab Badawi about the richest man in history. No, not Bill Gates, Warren Buffett or Elon Musk, but the 14th century African king whose legendary spending sprees crashed the value of gold, and why the people of Sudan don't eat much fish. Plus, Africa is the world's youngest continent with a median age of 19. So why does it have the oldest leaders on the planet? Stay with us for that. But first, let's say hello to Patrick Smith, editor of Africa Confidential. He's here in London too. Hi, Patrick.
Greetings, Martine. How's everything going in the Republic of East Dulwich?
It's not too bad. And hello to Donu, a journalist, columnist and YouTuber extraordinaire in Abuja, the Nigerian capital. Hey, Donu, nice to see you.
Hi, Martine, Patrick and everyone else.
Donu and Patrick will help me unpack these issues with their usual flair. Now, Africa is the youngest continent in the world, with 70% of people in sub-Saharan Africa under the age of 30, according to the UN. Yet, its leaders are among the oldest. President Paul Biya of Cameroon, for instance, he's 91, making him the oldest in the world. He's been at the top for 42 years. There's President Teodoro Obiang Nguema of Equatorial Guinea, Denis Sassou Nguesso in Congo, Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, Isaias Afwerki in Eritrea. They're all in their 70s and 80s, and they've been in power for decades. And of course, we mustn't forget Robert Mugabe, must we? He was ousted at the ripe old age of 93 after a mere 37 years in the top job. The list goes on. Let's speak to Dr. Joseph Adebayo, an independent researcher who's written on the subject. Welcome to Africa Here and Now, Joseph. Really nice to talk to you. What is this effect, the effect of the gerontocracy having on African politics generally?
Thank you for having me. You rightly introduced. We have the youngest continent. We are the youngest continent, as it were, in the world. And the impact has been that whilst we have a burgeoning young population, innovative and creative, as you see on social media, Afrobeat, sports and entertainment and all of that, you have a huge gulf where those creative young people are being governed and led by people who, started this political journey in the 60s, 70s, and some 80s.
So why is it that the gerontocracy is not being ousted, is not being eased aside by this younger cohort of potential leaders? I mean, haven't they got the stamina?
Well, I think that young people are, whether wittingly or unwittingly, have become foot soldiers for the gerontocrats. So when you have political leaders in their 70s vying for political office, often, especially now with the advent of social media, it is young people that they use to push their causes. So you see across the nation, you see on social media, the people who put out threads in support of political candidates are often young people, who should be supporting other young people. So rather than run for office, it seems that young people are happy to take their share. And that's what has happened with the political structures in Africa, where you have the youth wing of political parties. So rather than run for political office, for the presidency or governor, they are happy with being political youth wing leaders. So it's a way of settling, as it were, young people. And so you'll see people in their early 40s or even early 50s, as youth wing leaders of political parties. And these youth wing leaders have offices, they have assistants, and they have a budget, So as long as they are happy, so it's like being in a large room and asking the young children to go to the other room to play while the elders discuss.
This might be an opportune moment for us to play in a little bit of what Patrick Lumumba, the famed, distinguished lawyer and Pan-Africanist, what he had to say about Africa's young generation. Let's have a listen.
I'm quite clear in my mind that holding all factors constant, the younger generation is, in my view, even more dangerous to Africa.
Oh dear.
Because they have learned from the older generation. Remember the age-old saying that when mother cow is chewing cud, baby cow, namely the calf, is watching very keenly. The next generation of Africans is waiting for the opportunity to be thieves. And a recent survey in Kenya demonstrated that over 40% of young people think that there is nothing wrong with corruption. The only thing that they think is wrong is to be arrested, and that the only thing that you must do is to avoid being arrested. And I'm quite certain that if a survey were to be conducted in Nigeria, many young Nigerians would love to be in the opportunity, in the situation where they can steal. So that people condemn corruption sometimes not because they hate it, but because they themselves don't have the opportunity to be corrupt.
Now, that's a pretty damning view of the younger generation. So what, potentially, Joseph, do you think young people can add to the political scene in Africa, given Patrick Lumumba's rather withering assessment of them?
I agree 100% with Professor Lumumba. Sadly so, recent happenings in Nigeria have suggested that he's correct. We had a governor who was arguably one of the youngest governors in Nigeria, who served for 8 years and has been accused by the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission of misappropriating over 80 billion Nigerian naira. James Ibori was in his 30s when he was governor, ended up in prison for corruption. And the list is endless of young people who've been given political opportunities, who've ended up almost becoming worse than the people they planned or hoped to take over for.
I was going to ask you how significant you thought the election of the new Senegalese president, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, whether you think that's significant. I mean, he is the youngest elected leader in Africa. He's around 44, I believe.
Yes, it's significant. I mean, obviously, the more young people we see in political positions in Africa, the more, young people across the continent will feel encouraged to vie for office. But Senegal is one country among Africa's 54 states. There are several factors to consider. How cultural factors also affect the relationship between the young and the old. There's the role of money in politics. There's the political structure of political parties in Africa. So yes, we are happy for Senegal, but Senegal is one of 54.
So what's necessary then? What do you think needs to happen in order to effect this generational shift is what we're talking about, right?
Yes. So I think it starts from the political will, first of all, from young people. If you look at most African countries, I'll take Nigeria, for example. You see people who have done well in information technology, in businesses, young people who have run, businesses in the millions of dollars. So it shows that young people have the capacity, and they've shown it in business, in entertainment, in sports. Well, whether that translates into political capacity is another issue entirely. And there's a narrative out there that politics is dirty, politics is for politicians, so it's not as attractive as it were for young people.
And is it a coincidence then that the older the leader, the longer they tend to stay in office? We're talking about decade after decade after decade.
Yes, enabled by young people. I will repeat what I said from the beginning. Whether it's Atiku Abubakar, whether it's Bola Tinubu, I'm speaking from in the context of Nigeria. Most of their leading supporters are young people who push their candidacy on social media. They are enabled by young people. So it's a challenge that we have as a people, just across the entire continent.
Well, Joseph, do you find what I find, which is that here in Nigeria, people are very delusional about aging. So you often find a man of 58 saying, a young man like me. And you say, well, you're not young, you're middle-aged, and they don't accept it. And that's part of the problem, is that aging, people are very much in denial about aging.
So in our discussion, I'm careful that we also don't delve towards ageism, unwittingly, because I think that one of the major issue we have, or the major concern I have, is that most times in Africa, when we talk about the young taking over, we assume that that youth translates to competence.
No, I don't assume that at all. I mean, I have young staff.
Yes.
Trust me. In fact, if anything, educational standards have dropped. And
Absolutely.
yeah, I mean, I find that people who went to school in the 50s and 60s in this country, are far better educated.
I agree too. I agree. And so I think that what we need is how to manage both generations. I don't subscribe to completely removing, in quote, the old. I think that the experience is important. I think that we need the mix. We need the experience in the system. But what I subscribe to is a system that allows young people, equal opportunities to run for elective positions and, hopefully be voted for.
Joseph, I wanted to ask you whether you thought it was really part of a wider failure of political organization and representativity, because I thought the age thing is a bit of a side issue in a way. I mean, if the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the United States cannot come up with candidates under the age of 78 for what is arguably the most important political position in the world, what sort of example does that set to political organizations everywhere? If the political class are not representative of the wider population, then the political leadership of those parties isn't going to be representative.
Yes, I agree with you, Patrick, absolutely. The major issue is with the structure of political parties on the continent. It takes a lot to build social capital, especially in Africa. To be president of Nigeria, apart from other factors such as money, you need a lot of social capital. So if you are from Lagos, you need to have friends in the Northeast, Northwest, Southeast, South. Obviously, there are other factors. And this takes years, So people like Bola Ahmed Tinubu, people like Atiku Abubakar have been in the system for years enough to build social capital across geopolitical divides. The structure of political parties who already have these networks. But the problem is that within political parties, young people are relegated to the youth wings, whether it's the youth wings of the ANC or the APC or the PDP.
It might be worth pointing out that in the African National Congress in South Africa, I mean, some of the greatest leaders came out of the youth wing. Mandela, Tambo, Walter Sisulu, all these characters came out of the youth wing, and they radicalized the party and gave it the oomph that it needed to launch the anti-apartheid campaign and eventually get victory.
Yes, most of the independent movements started as youth movements. So I agree, and I will go back to what Donu said about the failing standard of education. That something happened, the educational standard fell, and it impacted everything, including youth movement, the ideology that drove the independent movement. The youth movements today, the political wings of political parties today are just ways of settling, as it were, young people and keeping them quiet.
Thank you so much, Joseph Adebayo.
Thank you so much for having me.
Right, so that was an interesting chat, wasn't it, with Joseph Adebayo? Now, Patrick, what have you been up to? What's been grabbing your attention of late?
Yeah, well, I've just come back from Ghana, which is one of the biggest gold mining economies on the continent. The other big gold mining economy on the continent is South Africa, and it's at the center of a brutal takeover battle. It's a company you'll all be aware of, I guess, called Anglo American. It used to be called South Africa Inc. It's now in the sights of what South Africans call the Big Australian, the biggest mining company in the world, called BHP. And it's put in an offer of $31 billion to buy Anglo American, which is a big deal in the world of mining and, of course, the world of jobs, because tens of thousands of jobs and tens of billions of dollars for the South African economy and the Australian economy are at stake. The problem is BHP says it doesn't want any of Anglo American's South African mines. All it's interested in is the copper mines that Anglo American bought in South America. So it's turned into a big political row in South Africa, with the mines minister, Gwede Mantashe, who used to run the National Union of Mine Workers with President Cyril Ramaphosa in the halcyon days of the 1980s. And he's saying, no way, the big Australian must not take over South Africa's pride and joy, Anglo American. So Anglo American has transited from being the sort of bane of the anti-apartheid campaigners into becoming a kind of national champion for South Africa.
And it sounds very much as though South Africa is selling off the family silver. I mean, it's that bad. Is it indicative of the general state of the South African economy?
That is exactly what the centre-right Democratic Alliance is saying the reason why the Australians are coming to South Africa and saying, we just want your company's assets in South America. We don't want any of your stuff because you've mismanaged the economy in the mining sector so badly, is now worthless. And so it's fueling this big political row between the government, the trade unions, and the Democratic Alliance, which really thinks it's got a sniff of power in the elections at the end of this month.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, there will be few among our audience who don't know Zeinab Badawi, journalist, broadcaster, former chair of the Royal Africa Society, etc., etc. These days, Zeinab is president of SOAS, which is part of the University of London, and she's just cut her teeth as an author. An African History of Africa is just that. It's a comprehensive review of the continent from ancient times through to the era of independence. Zeinab crossed Africa, went up and down, back and forth several times, seeking the expert analysis of African archaeologists, of paleontologists, anthropologists, and historians, and that's mentioning just a few. And she's produced a fine book. Welcome, Zeinab. It's a fabulous book. Congratulations. It's doing so well.
Thank you so much, Martine, and hello to everybody. You know what? I mean, it sounds like I'm bragging, but it did go to the #1 slot in the Times newspaper bestsellers list for hardback nonfiction. And that gave me a great deal of satisfaction, not only because it was validation of the project that I had embarked on over really the best part of a decade, but it's because it shone a light on Africa and on African history in a general readership. And that's what really made me so happy about the fact that it's doing so well.
I can well imagine. Now, in seeking out the specific African perspectives on the history of the continent, what were the sorts of attitudes and opinions that you were looking to challenge?
So I think that Africa's history, for the most part, if you look at a lot of reading lists, has been written by outsiders. As soon as the Europeans arrived in Africa, they began recording Africa's history and what they saw, and the missionaries and the explorers and the colonial officers and the enslavers. So that has given us a rather skewed perspective of Africa, because they were looking at African history, African culture and society through their own lens. And what I wanted to do in my book was to invert the telescope, as it were, and to say, this is how African historians, archaeologists and anthropologists and cultural experts see their history. And I thought that was a very, very important exercise, because you do find, a differing perspective.
And was there anything in particular that surprised you? I mean, in the introduction, I mentioned that you feature in the book the world's richest man, the richest man in history. And I say this is not Bill Gates. Forget Jeff Bezos, forget Elon Musk. Tell us about the richest man in history. I mean, he's quite something.
What a wonderful man he was. So he was born around 1280, died around 1332, and his name was Mansa Musa. And Mansa merely was the title given to the kings of the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire was established in 1235 by a man called Sunjata Keita, who saw off his rivals and established the Mali Empire. And Mansa Musa is the best known of the kings of Mali because he embarked on a pilgrimage, which, you know, he just had such a lavish entourage with him. And his caravan was weighed down with gold and porters and, you know, domestic servants and all the rest of it. And when he got to Saudi Arabia, well, it wasn't Saudi Arabia then, when he got to Mecca, he stayed for a while. On his return, he went to Cairo, and he and his entourage spent so much money in Cairo that the price of gold plummeted globally by about 25%, and it took about 8 years for the price of gold to recover. And by today's standards, his wealth is estimated at about more than 400 billion US dollars. And this is what Professor Doulay Konati at the University of Mali in Bamako said to me. You know, that would be about right. But what I like about that story is it illustrates the fact that even in medieval times, Africa was part of the global economy. It wasn't just an entity or, you know, that stood on the sidelines of the world, of global history, that the actions of one individual had an impact on world prices of the commodity gold.
Hi, Zeinab. Yeah, congratulations. I mean, it's a stunning achievement. I mean, to get a book on Africa as the best-selling non-fiction book in Britain, you know, chapeau, as they say. That's absolutely brilliant news. A couple of things I wanted to ask you about. There's this school of thought, people like Martin Bernal and so on, who have said there's a big gap in our sort of chronological understanding of how Africa fits into global history. And one of the things he goes on about at great length is the contribution of Northeast Africa, Egypt, Sudan, and so on to the Greco-Roman civilizations. I wondered, you know, when you were researching this, what evidence you found to support that we've actually really got to reconsider the origins of global civilization, well, particularly Western civilization, and that Africa was right there at the beginning, particularly Northeast Africa.
Absolutely. I mean, both Egypt and ancient Sudan, northern Sudan, particularly where I was born, you know, had civilizations which were ancient. Everybody's heard about ancient Egypt, obviously Mesopotamia, in what is today Iraq. But very few people realize that the civilization of Napata in northern Sudan, in its earliest form, predated Greece, ancient Greece, and Rome. And the successors of this civilization in northern Sudan, in northeast Africa, were responsible. Sudanese archaeologists believe, for example, of the enameling of pottery. So that is something which we associate very much with, you know, the ancient Greek period, the beautiful pottery that they have. But it is believed that the ancient Sudanese were the first to do that. It is also believed that the ancient Sudanese were perhaps the first to dye material, you know, to actually use colors. So I think that you're absolutely right. What we often think of as just, you know, Western civilization and that Africa did not play a part, it is something that really requires, you know, a new lens.
And Donu?
Well, congratulations. Very proud of you, Zainab.
Thank you.
Because actually, you know, there is a tradition of, there have been Africans who have written distinguished histories of the continent, like my father's friends, Professor Jacob Adebayo and Professor Dike. But that was a long time ago. and B, they were men. As far as I know, you're the only woman who's taken on this huge challenge. And I'm thrilled that you're number one in the bestseller lists. I will certainly be advertising your book widely on all my social media channels. People always accuse me of being too Eurocentric. So I shall show them. You're going to give me some credibility, okay? Yes, we know that there was a time when Africa was rising. So what happened? Why are we now,
Yes.
in the dark? We can't blame colonialism totally or slavery totally, because these are phenomena that spread across the world. And, the Romans colonized Britain for 400 years. And Britain's not in the doldrums now.
That's a debate.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, that is a debate.
Yeah, well, at least everyone gets to go to school
Yes, yes.
and gets medical treatment.
No, I mean, I agree with you now for, populations that exist in Africa now to say to them, the reason why you don't have a school to go to or a hospital to be treated in is all because of colonialism. Countries have been independent for, more than 60 years for the most part. And I mean, I don't want to completely, however, absolve the impact of the Europeans on Africa's subsequent development. I think that it is remarkable how durable the negative impacts of the European presence economically have actually, prevailed even into the modern era. The fact that Africa, for the most part, still produces, raw materials. It has not industrialized. They don't have access to technology because of patents, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's equipment that will help them, embark on renewable energy. So I still do think the international economic order is skewed against Africa. I mean, even look at things like the brain drain, the nurses, the doctors who obviously work in high and middle income countries, depriving their own countries of a very, very important, health workforce. And these countries are not compensated. And that has depleted Africa's abilities. So I think that you do really need to look at just how fair the system is. I think also another factor.
But Zeinab, can I just
Yeah.
interrupt you and ask you, whose fault is it that they're all fleeing their own countries?
Yes, no, I agree. The push factor. But nevertheless, it's a reality. I also think that African countries were really not created until the end of the 19th century after the Berlin Conference. Before that, you may have had Egypt, that was fairly coherent, Ethiopia, a few, maybe one or two countries that existed as those, but they were, and the Brits and the Europeans admitted that they just drew lines. And so I think national cohesion has been a real challenge for African countries where, people do look to their communities much more than they do to their nation, national identity. I also think that in some cases, countries in Africa that had to fight for their independence, studies again show that these countries have continued on a violent path, unlike those who won their independence through relatively peaceful means, like Ghana, through mass civil disobedience and so on, compared to a country like Algeria, which really continued on a very violent trajectory. Even South Africa, where violence became the language of political discourse. So I do think that I agree fundamentally with you that you can't say anymore that these are reasons why you cannot provide for your citizens. And of course, corruption, economic mismanagement, cronyism, nepotism, people staying in power for too long, all the sorts of things that we know about Africa. Bear the biggest burden of responsibility, but I don't think that we can ignore the international economic order as well.
Zeinab, you made the point about your interest in Africa's economic role in the global system. And you are now president of SOAS. How vibrant is the debate about Africa's role in the global system, do you think, at the moment? Is that really getting interest from where you sit as head of SOAS?
Yeah, I think that when I talk to both the teaching staff and students at SOAS, I think personally that there has been a shift. And also academics and people I speak to on the continent. I think that the COVID-19 vaccine debacle, when Europeans and Western nations were triple vaccinating their people, and Africa had to just wait for the crumbs, coming off the table. I've never known Africans to be so angry, really. Somebody I've had long discussions with about this is Professor Christian Happy, a Cameroonian-born brilliant scientist who abandoned his laboratory in Harvard, a great career, one of the world's top scientists, and moved to Nigeria, to Ibadan, to set up his own lab there. And I think that he's indicative of this argument, which says if Africa continues to rely on outsiders, this is what happens. Now, I think most Africans have known that, but I do think that the COVID-19, what Cyril Ramaphosa dubbed vaccine apartheid, I think really brought that home to people. And I think they realize that there is this imbalance. So I personally think that there has been a bit of a shift. Also, 2015, the movement that began in South Africa amongst the students at University of Cape Town to decolonize their education curriculums, which has resonated around, the world. We've seen it here in the UK. We've seen it at SOAS. The students have said, look, on our Africa Studies programs, please, can we have more African sources for us to go to, for sure, for sure. And I think the restitution debate also about Africa's artifacts being returned, it may still just be lip service for the most part, but that debate has really accelerated, partly because of that report in 2018 commissioned by the French government, which found that more than 90% of Africa's artifacts are held outside the continent. So I think that I think that the direction of travel is going in the right way for a number of reasons. Reparations debate about the transatlantic slave trade has gained momentum. It's happening, piecemeal.
You mentioned the transatlantic slave trade, Zainab. I was quite taken in the book by the mention of that much lesser known aspect of the trade in human beings that lasted for much longer as well. And that's on the Indian Ocean side, and the complicity of the Africans in the Arab trading of African people. This is something that, as we've established, hasn't really been researched and hasn't really been probed into as much as the transatlantic branch of the trade.
You're absolutely right, Martine. And I do address that tragic chapter in Africa's history. So you're absolutely right that the Indian Ocean slave trade, but also across the Red Sea and also the trans-Saharan trade to the north of Africa, where, the Arabs had arrived in North Africa, and as I said, mixed with the local Amazigh, or given their other name, Berber populations, also took enslaved people from other parts of the continent. And they numbered in total about 14 million, starting from the perhaps late 7th century, but more in earnest from the 700s, and lasted much later until the late 19th century. And the Arabs and their partners, I mean, the Arabs did take enslaved people from other parts of the world, but they mostly took them from Africa. And they and their partners on the continent, just as we saw in the transatlantic slave trade, there were those African elites who facilitated the transatlantic slave trade. They did the same with the Arabs. And the numbers are much greater, 14 million to about 12.5 million for the transatlantic slave trade. And I look at the differences between the two trades. In the Arab slave trade, women were preferred because they were often taken as concubines, as sex slaves, essentially. In the transatlantic trade, men were preferred because they were needed for the back-breaking work on the plantations in South America, North America. But yes, I mean, I do think there needs to be a greater debate about the involvement of the Arabs. There isn't much going on now at all. The Qataris have kind of dipped their toe with their house of enslavement in the Belmood house in Qatar, in Doha. Doha, the capital of Qatar. But there isn't really much of a debate. And I think one of the reasons why that may be the case is one critical difference between the two trades is if an Arab man had a child with an enslaved woman, that child would be born free and indeed would rise to a high position in society, could even be a prince. And so there may be a reluctance for those Arabs who are the descendants of enslaved women to advertise that fact because they occupy elite positions. Indeed, even in the Saudi royal family itself, there are those who have African blood in them. Whereas in the transatlantic trade, if a white man had a child with an enslaved African woman, that child would be born a slave.
Donu.
And Zainab, do you find your assertion, which of course is accurate, that the whole of humanity originated in Africa? How do you find that goes down in certain gatherings? I mean, I'm sure it goes down fine at the Royal African Society and various woke gatherings. But, what about places? What about other more toxic settings?
Well, I've not gone into the deep south with a deep south of the United States of America to a conservative community and waved the fact that we are all descendants of the first, hominins in Africa. Look, I think there has been resistance. I mean, scientifically, the debate is settled. Africa is where the human story begins. I think that what people might find surprising is that up until between 8 to 12,000 years ago, everybody was dark-skinned. That flaxen hair, pale complexions, light-colored irises only developed between 8 to 12,000 years ago. We can't be exactly sure when in that period till we find a skin. But this, I think, when you think about it, is actually relatively recently. So I wanted to start the book there because I did want to emphasize this fact that if you're not African or of African descent living in the diaspora, you are still somebody who has to say that Africa was your original mother continent. And therefore, aren't you interested in what happened on the continent?
Absolutely. Zainab, can I take you back to particularly Northern Sudan, which of course is where you were born, and the Kingdom of Kush chapter, which I particularly liked. And I sense there was a certain amount of emotion in you, especially when you were engaging with the women there, because there were so many similarities that you identified today that were in existence thousands of years ago.
Yes, I did. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about history. People think it's just about the past, but history not only explains the past, it also informs our present and, helps shape the future. And I was struck by the fact that a lot of things which I recognized in my grandmother's home, the big kind of ceramic urns in which they kept water was something that the Kushites had, the low stools, the plaited hairstyles where women would keep their hair very long with very thin plaits, the black coal liner that my grandmother always wore. In fact, it was Queen Hatshepsut, who was born around 1507 to 1458 BCE in ancient Egypt, a great queen of ancient Egypt, who is credited with using pulverized burnt frankincense as coal eyeliner, as being the first person to have done that. And it was obviously something because the Kushites did, in many cases, have very similar traditions to the ancient Egyptians. But one striking difference between them and the ancient Egyptians is that the Kushites did not eat fish. Imagine they had all that source of protein in the River Nile, because, of course, the Blue and the White Nile run through Sudan, combine in Khartoum and become the single Nile and go into Egypt. And they considered it an abomination to eat fish. And even to this day, the consumption of fish in Sudan, at least in northern Sudan, is a fraction of what it is in Egypt. And I have a brother who can't bear fish. And there are many people like that in Sudan today, can't even stand, the sight of it, nor the smell. And I say to him, look, it's your genetic memory at play. So it is extraordinary how things are handed down. Yeah.
And finally, Zainab, many people know so much about you, or think they do. I wanted to ask you something that perhaps we don't know about you. What's your guilty pleasure, for instance?
My guilty pleasure. Well, I'm trying to cut down on it, but I would have to say my favorite food is chocolate.
Don't blame me.
Really good chocolate. 60 to 70%. About 60% is my ideal, but I'm trying to cut down on my sugar. And having consumed so much sugar all my life, mainly through chocolate, that it is now my guilty pleasure. And I now try and sneak some as often as I can. But yes, I would say my guilty pleasure is my sweet tooth manifesting. When people if you go to a fancy meal or something, they have the plate of petit four. Most people would content themselves with this one. I mean, I would just want to demolish the entire plate. And then I love Italian opera. Is that a guilty pleasure? I don't know. I adore Italian opera.
Well, it is if you're meant to be Afrocentric. My father was a great fan of opera, and he was always being told it's not politically correct.
I don't know, though, Donu Bari. I've heard this said to me. I do adore Italian opera, but for me, culture is universal. And it's true, opera originated in Italian, but it's like jazz is a Black African thing.
Exactly.
Reggae is again derived from, people of African descent. It would be like saying to Patrick, don't listen to Hugh Masekela.
Miles Davis.
Or Miles Davis.
Or Hugh Masekela.
Yeah, or don't listen to Bob Marley, and I think...
It's a travesty.
Yeah, it's a travesty. And I think that art is universal. And just as much as I love listening to Bob Marley and African American music, I love Motown, I also love Italian opera. But because of what you said, I keep it as a guilty secret.
Zeinab Badawi, thank you very much indeed. And congratulations again. So nice to talk to you.
Thank you.
Best of luck.
Bye.
Donu, wasn't that a great chat with Zainab? Wasn't it lovely to see her?
Oh, it was. It was. I mean, it's so nice to see a woman who is stylish and highly intelligent and doing something, special and being recognized for it.
Absolutely, yes. I didn't know you were an opera buff as well.
Oh, certainly. But I'm not as knowledgeable as my father or Zainab, but I know quite a lot about it.
Right. Now then, tell me what you've been up to. You've been meddling in a very, very interesting subject. Interesting for some, not for me, I've got to say. But tell me, Meghan and Harry have been in Nigeria, and I'm absolutely blown away by the kind of response that you've had to your YouTube insert that you put out on Friday.
I know, it's extraordinary. I mean, I just did an almost random 15 or 20-minute talk to camera about why I disapproved of Harry and Meghan, who were due to visit Nigeria that day that the video was coming out. And, I thought probably pick up a little bit more interest than normal. My staff were predicting excitedly that it would hit 10,000 views. And guess what? We're now heading towards 200,000. And that surprised me. Didn't know so many Nigerians were so interested. But there's also been plenty of responses from all over the world.
Well, exactly. I sort of understand Europeans, but why would Africans be so interested in Harry and Meghan?
Well, Harry and Meghan, of course, have a special, sort of news value because they are rebels. And of course, Meghan is half Black and claims indeed to be 43% Nigerian. I claim I contest vigorously.
That's impossible.
I know, it's completely impossible. But, Truth and Meghan Markle are not best friends. So, but anyway, because she says that she is 43% Nigerian and she's coming home, they tried to drum up this emotional thing about a homecoming, a bit like Kunta Kinte going back to the Gambia, Alex Haley. So it was a sort of like roots narrative. And, she is beautiful and she is stylish and he's a prince. So, it's got all the ingredients for a tabloid frenzy. But I didn't realize how much that was the case.
But is it pure sort of celebrity status that is capturing people's imagination, or is it that they're particularly interested in these renegade royals?
Well, I think there's two schools of thought. I mean, there are the people who, like me, are into traditional family values and think that Harry should not have disrespected his father or his grandparents who died shortly afterwards. Actually, if they were Nigerian, the Nigerians would have said that Harry kills them. But I remember my mother telling me when I was a teenager that some uncle of ours had died. And I said, oh no, what happened? She said, his son took to discos.
Oh my goodness.
So, sort of facetiousness aside, there's a whole bunch of Nigerians who do not like the way they behave towards the elders in their family. And, as you know, Nigerians are not terribly obsessed with the whole racism thing as experienced by Black people in the Western world. They're not as interested in it. And they tend to think that it's not a good enough excuse to go on to Oprah Winfrey and diss your entire family. But there are also the people who think, well, kind of this poor Black girl marries into the British royal family and is treated like crap. Excuse my language. So some of them think, well, let's show her that there's somewhere she's welcome. But the reception she got here was actually quite low key. I mean, she didn't meet that many important people. They didn't pull out all the stops. The venues were small and frankly a bit dingy. And there was criticism of the way she dressed. So it was sort of like they got goodwill, but they also got some, blah, some indifference.
Thank you so much, Donu. Now, that's it for this edition of Africa Here and Now. Let me know what you like, what you'd like to hear more about. There's our website, www.AfricaHere&NOW.com. We're on YouTube. Please subscribe and share. I'm on X at Martine Dennis. You can follow us on Instagram and on Facebook. And of course, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. We recorded this on Monday, the 13th of May, 2024. Our producer is Anne Busby. Our original music is by Enric Adam, Anna DeWolf Evans, and Charlie Panton put everything together. Thanks to our guests, Zeinab Badawi and Dr. Joseph Adebayo. From Donu, Patrick and me, thank you for your company.